Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched Slashback from 2022. Now, I was thinking back, trying to remember exactly when I became aware, why I came aware of this movie, because upon checking, this movie really did not get much of a wide release at all. In fact, I don't even know who picked it up initially. I think I may have found out about it when it was initially released at TIFF, but that may not have been the case. Anyway, the history behind it, I don't entirely remember personally, but it was in my list, and it caught my eye and felt like the thing to watch this week. Interestingly, I actually mixed this up with a different movie in some respects, which I mixed it up with Prey, which also came out in 2022, which was the Native American themed Predator movie. I don't think that one was particularly well regarded. After looking at it again, I haven't seen it though, so I don't know. But I mixed the two up because it's a little weird having two, or a little unusual, I should say, having two Native peoples horror franchises release in the same year in Hollywood. That's surprising. One is surprising. Two is kind of unbelievable. But this was a much smaller production, which I had to remind myself of as I was watching through it. As I noted, this didn't get a particularly wide release, and I can understand why. This, compared to something that was tied into the Predator franchise, this would have been much lower budget and a whole bunch of other things like that. But it's still an interesting film, nonetheless, and I'm certainly not disappointed. It was on my list for a reason. That said, it has a lot of shortcomings, and I'm still sort of grappling with whether or not I particularly like it. It is interesting solely on the basis of, well, first and foremost, on the basis of being about a remote Inuit community in Canada, and all that comes with that. What is kind of disappointing right off that, though, is that I don't feel like it puts that to its full use. It hints at lots of things it wants to talk about and themes that are appropriate to the unique setting, but it never really utilizes it to the fullest extent that I want. They talk about the fact that, this is a poor remote community with a lot of kids who are, sort of grappling with both being in a remote community, not having a lot of access to a lot of, other things that they know about, but then also being very attached to social media and seeing what the rest of the world can be like, and having, various feelings about their situation and the things that they don't have access to and wish they did, or the things they want to do, those sorts of things. And as well, having a horror movie about kids is an opportunity for some interesting storytelling. Ultimately, I'm going to draw a couple of comparisons between this and another movie that we watched some time ago, Get Duked, because I think there are ups and downs to both movies. I mean, it's apples and oranges, but worth taking some comparisons. And I think it's also really interesting to take some thematic and sort of both narrative hints and some integrated storytelling from a community and a culture that has a different perspective on certain types of monsters and mythology and those sorts of things. In Hollywood, horror movies are... we could get into a whole discussion about what exactly horror movies have been like over the years. But it's, practically mimetic at this point that, oh no, the, uninformed white guy is going to do something stupid in a horror movie and die in a horrible way because he's dumb or whatever. Those are the tropes that we have in a lot of horror. And there's a lot to unpack there, but I think part of that's often not necessarily acknowledged is Western European influenced culture largely does not have a lot of mythology, or has had a lot of its mythology erased over the millennia. So we don't have a lot of mythology in the US and Western Europe about monsters and things. We could get into talking about things like cryptids and stuff like neo mythology type of stuff that's more recent, but compared to a community and a culture that has a more long-standing mythology and stories that are more sort of pervasive in that way, it's really interesting, or potentially really interesting, to see a community that has stories everybody knows about monsters like skinwalkers, that they can use that as a reference point. The characters can use that as a reference point to go, oh, it's like this thing or something like that. And they do make reference to that in this film on a couple of occasions. They also key in on these kids are still tuned into Western pop culture. They're not completely remote. They're very, attached to social media and that sort of thing. And so they make direct allusions to, like, oh, these kids are talking about The Thing, one of them has seen The Thing. And so they make a direct reference to, it's just like that thing, or something like that. And that is both interesting in a narrative sense, but also ultimately kind of a mistake, I think, from a meta-narrative perspective, because anytime you draw a direct media comparison within a text, there's inevitably going to be an interest by the viewer to sort of draw a direct comparison. If you talk about The Thing in your movie, people are going to think about The Thing. And if your movie is not as good as The Thing, which is a high bar, then you might be doing yourself a disservice in the comparison. So, yeah, it's more of a potentially interesting thing to me than it is great in execution. There's a lot of things, to be totally honest, in this movie that I think are better in concept than they are in execution. And I don't have a budget number in front of me for this. I have to assume it was fairly low. So there's a lot of limitations that this movie was probably working with. That said, there are other things that are just ultimately failures of writing or production. I believe this is a first-time writer and director who is, I believe, also of Inuit descent or something. Let me double check that before I actually say that. Yeah, okay, yeah, she is. Which is great to have, unique stories and unique perspectives coming out of that community that aren't directed by somebody who isn't from that community. But that doesn't change the fact that there are certain cinematic expectations that are not necessarily met by somebody who is a first-time writer and director. The directing is not terrible. The cinematography is not terrible. I think a lot of my qualms with it come down to the limitations of the budget, probably. There are opportunities to make better cinematic choices, cinematography choices, stylistic choices that I don't agree with, things that I think could have been put on Steadicam or could have been lockdown shots or things like that. Opportunities where I think framing is not great, those sorts of things. But they're mostly fairly minor. I'm not, it's not offensive, and I wouldn't even say that it's down to being like the quality of a student movie, but it's it often doesn't look super professional. How much of that is down to budget, I don't necessarily know. As far as the writing, though, that's where I really start to have some issues, and we're going to talk about the acting as well, because the two ultimately always tie together. The writing is pretty rough. From an overarching narrative perspective, I don't think this movie has a super well-defined narrative arc. It's a very simple story. It is heavily drawing from classic horror tropes from the last century, the whole history of horror cinema, and it's not really turning a lot of those on their head. Again, that's an opportunity I would have liked to see used more when you have characters that are not coming from the prevailing culture that's portrayed in horror. I would have liked to see more opportunities for subversion of those tropes, or twists on them instead. So having a very basic narrative that's very heavily tropified is not a sin unto itself, but then your writing still needs to be good. The dialogue still needs to be well written. The execution still needs to be well done, those sorts of things to make those tropes fly. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the writing is both a little bit mediocre, and uninspired, and it's also being it's inappropriate for the characters, is basically what it comes down to. A lot of the writing does not sound like kids, and when 95% of the character lines delivered in this movie are by teenagers or younger, I think you have to be really careful about writing kids. This is something I've talked about many times before, and some movies do it great and some do not. But I often got the feeling that I was often removed from the narrative because a character said something that I just could not believe that character would say. Whether it was the wording of what they said, or the particular insight or lack thereof, or a level of, sort of maturity or lack of maturity, vacillating up and down between completely competent and completely incompetent, that makes me feel like it was a lot of the characters are very inconsistently written. They're not super well defined. They do little things. They actually spend a substantial amount of the movie's runtime showing domestic scenes, normal scenes of everyday life for the characters, or mostly normal scenes. And so spending that much time on those scenes, but having the characters still be largely very ill-defined, very tropified kid characters, those sorts of things, is a disappointment. And I think that's a lot down to the writing. I think I can't go into it that much more, other than if you've seen it before, you've seen it, of kids who are written like adults. Whether or not they're competent or not, or appropriately competent for their age, is a kind of separate but adjacent question. And so even trying to follow the motivations of the characters, or their particular drive, the elements that even make them think they should do certain things, those are very ill-defined for the overall arc of the story. And I wanted that to be, I wanted there to be more there. I wanted the arc of the story to be better defined. I wanted the threat to be better defined, with this being, ostensibly a horror movie. I don't need a lot of definition. It's horror, a lot of it is about it being immersed in the experience rather than a complicated narrative. But I often couldn't believe that couldn't understand why the characters suddenly decided to go do something. Um, uh, uh, they just didn't seem to be written as such. And that, I think, leads us into talking about the acting, which I feel a little guilty harping on, because apparently I think most or all of the actors came out of the actual community that the place was that the movie was filmed in, which was actually, up in this like Baffin Bay area, I think, in sort of very northern Canada. And so when you're casting from a small remote community that, has all the features of the place you're actually setting it in, I think that's generally a great thing. But that comes with caveats, especially about writing and acting skills. I don't think any of these actors had particular formal training, and that shows. And it shows worse when your writing isn't particularly good. So, child actors who are already, a gamble, even when they're very experienced child actors, they can be very bad. But if you have actors who are children and they don't have a lot of experience and they're reading a bad script, that's a recipe for a lot of very stilted, wooden acting, and a lot of overacting, overreactions, and unbelievable acting from actors who could probably have improv'd better. And maybe there was improv in this, but it felt very stilted. It felt very much like these were kids who were probably given their scripts to read, shortly before the scene was shot, and then, asked to rerun it a few times, and that was about it. And that's not necessarily a problem. It depends on the production, right? That's where I'm sort of landing on this. Is I feel I don't know enough about the production and the release of this, but when a lot of the production elements feel like it's a higher budget movie that's aiming for the sort of cinematic beats that are not of an indie film, that it's aiming for larger release, then I start to have certain expectations. So I almost wish they had dialed back the scope, the target of this, because it feels targeted at a very Hollywood type of audience. Again, I'll also compare it to what was that movie, Troll Hunter, I think, that we watched quite some time ago now, which sort of very much focused on the less cinematic, less Hollywoodized version of things, and sort of leaned into its unique elements and being an indie movie. And this felt too often like something that was striving for a very Hollywood type of greatness, rather than enjoying the unique elements that it had at its disposal. I don't know if you could have made this movie heavily in a heavily improved way. I tend to think that kids are often better than adults at doing improv, and so I've never, it's not something I've ever done, but I would like to see somebody do a movie like this that has, a movie with a bunch of kids where a lot of it is done as improv. There's probably movies out there that have done that before. But I can almost imagine a version of this story that plays out better and more believably with the characters telling their own story, with them being inventive in their own ways, or even being a collaborative effort, between between the proper writers and then the improvisational elements from the actors. There's a few other production things that I can give ups and downs. I think the music's really really good. There's only a couple of songs and they get reused a couple of times. But having a different kind of sound that's influenced by the cultural music, I think is great, and sort of lends to both the setting and when it's also it's used diegetic and non-diegetically. So when the characters are singing their own songs in their language, I think that's like super fun too and immersive, and that adds, that deepens that specific cultural flavor that I think is fantastic and should always be encouraged. On the flip side, again, the things that it's trying to do that are more Hollywood end up being the flops. So too many of the effects are done not well enough, whether it's basically all the monster stuff, let's say. The CGI generally looks pretty cheap. I think they could have done less, just do less of it, or redesign the monsters such that they can be done with more practical, less digital effects. It's I love practical effects. I think that and often practical effects can be done really well on fairly small budgets. I don't know if they had access to the people who would have those types of skills to make those practical effects happen. There were a few practical effects things, but I don't think there were any. I can't think of any shots actually that were solely practical effects. Usually it was at least a combination of practical and digital. And it's just, it's always a disrupting. It disrupts the believability for me when the CGI just doesn't look all that great. That said, there are some like fun, unique takes on it, like the first signs of the monsters being sort of, oh, that shouldn't move that way or something like that. And then there's other just, I think things that are fine, like the very minor spoilers here. I mean, it's on the poster that's in front of you, but the skinwalked characters who are, wearing like masks and stuff, who have their sort of faces askew and that sort of thing. That's all fine. It's not excellently done. It's done with cheap masks, but it's whatever. It works fine for the setting of the plot. And if this was a really budget feeling movie that wasn't, striving for that Hollywood look, I think I'd be more willing to be like, oh yeah, totally. It's just, it's just a cheap budget indie horror movie. It's fun. And actually, that reminds me, that's sort of the biggest thing for me is I think this movie misses its tone. It can't really decide whether it's a movie about a bunch of kids or it's a proper horror movie. And it has very little levity in it. It has very little emotion in general, actually, even though there are a lot of things that should have emotional beats to them. More often than not, because of all the things I mentioned before that I don't think are that great, I wasn't that invested. And so like the emotional stakes didn't seem that high, even when characters who we're supposed to care about were under like imminent bodily threat. I was like, this is probably going to work out fine, but I don't really know the characters that well. And the tone has not been set for this scene well enough for me to think there's real stakes and that sort of thing. But also because so much of the narrative is about these kids and their sort of day-to-day normal lives and dealing with the foibles of being kids, as well as the issues within their community. I felt like that could have been used to much greater effect. To This reminds me of another movie that I'm going to make reference to, a movie I think is fantastic, and I think I've mentioned before, Attack the Block, which is another horror movie with a bunch of kids in it. Um, that that's a perfect example of, okay, what happens in a Attack the Block is actually a great comparison. I really just came up with this now, but it's another marginalized community with issues in it, and a bunch of kids who are unsupervised and have their own issues they're dealing with and their own interpersonal stuff, but then are also contending with this monstrous threat. That's a great comparison. I don't know how their budgets compare and that sort of thing, and it's not entirely fair comparison, but that's the kind of thing I would like to see more. That's also a movie that, to the point I was just about to make, uses comedy to really good effect, because kids are fundamentally silly. I don't think it's really hard to make a dead serious movie with children, or with primarily children, because kids are just goofy. They just naturally are. They're curious, and they're curious about the world. They don't really understand a lot of things. They do things that to adults seem absurd and silly. Like, if you've ever worked with kids before, or you have kids, or whatever, I think this is a really common feeling of just frequently having to stifle laughter at children just saying silly things, or taking themselves really seriously even when nobody else does. And I think that's really missing from this film, when it shouldn't be. There's even some decent writing in within here that I think would fall into the properly comedic element there, and is just because of this very self-serious tone, it never uses that levity to good effect. And so, like I said, I didn't want to call this a student film, but it reminds me a little bit of the movies I made when I was in like high school, the things my friends and I wrote and then shot ourselves, and how awful they were, because we took ourselves so seriously, and we thought we were writing good stuff when we were not, and we thought our production and our acting and all these other things was better when it was not. And so it's like watching something with that sort of like student film self-seriousness without an ounce of irony. And that's really what this is missing more than anything else. It needs it needs more consistency in its tone, and it needs more self-awareness. And I think it desperately needs some comedy, because kids are silly. And especially in the face of things they don't understand, kids are extra silly. And so if this movie had leaned into the absurdity of, the things that kids take seriously, how seriously they take their little, teenage relationships and things like that, and the feelings of being a hormonal teen, or those sorts of things. All those are very silly things. And if they had leaned into the comedy of that, and then used that difference of perspective, used the fact that these are kids to have them be more inventive than the typical horror movie protagonists, that sort of thing, that would have made this way more compelling. And it could have been done without, so much of the budget probably going to these very Hollywoodized production elements. I think that was its biggest mistake. I don't know. I don't dislike this film. It's interesting. It's got a lot of little things that I think are potentially good. But I think the overall conception of it is based on a not great it's not, it's ill-defined. It just needs, it needs it needs to take itself less seriously. It needs to lean into the fact that these are kids. It needs to lean into the humor of those kids' behaviors, and yeah, just lean into the fact that it's an indie movie and it's a bit of fun. And horror movies can be fun when, they're being a little silly. Just like Get Duked. Anyway, I think that's about all I have to say about this. It's interesting, and it's not a waste of your time, but it's got a lot of things it could work on. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'll see you guys next time.